This is a pretty decent gaming PC built by a UK firm that buys in off-the-shelf components in bulk, puts them all together and sells them on. And you know what? It's not bad. Ryzen 5 3600, RTX 2060 Super, it's a touch slower than today's 3060, and yeah, 16 gigs of RAM, SSD storage, you get the idea. Thing is, this gaming laptop from Razer featuring a Core i7-10750H, an RTX 3070 mobile, and a 165Hz 1440p display is actually faster, and I paid £1,400 for it from Amazon. That's a really good price for a fully integrated system, and here's the thing. Gaming laptops haven't had the same kind of mega price inflation as discrete GPUs. There are actual deals out there if you're patient. So yeah, £1,400, not bad. Question is, just how good is it for gaming? So in this video, brought to you by Digital Foundry and Nvidia, I'm going to be focusing on this machine and what kind of experience I got from this class of graphics hardware, because I'm pretty pleased with my purchase actually. Choosing a laptop over a desktop is all about use cases really. A bigger, bulky option like a full-blown tower PC opens the door to maximum performance and opens up a range of upgrade options, but it may not make sense if you need portability, if you want to take your games and your work with you wherever you go. The price of portability is that power budgets are lower, cooling is more challenging, so it's no secret that performance will be lower. Typically in your standard hardware review, the capabilities of a GPU are defined by a number, a percentage point differential against another GPU. And that number is weighted by its price point. And you know, that's absolutely fair enough. But in this video, I purposefully didn't benchmark the RTX 3070 mobile in the Razer laptop, not to begin with anyway. I played some games instead, compared the experience to a baseline set by the standards of the new generation of consoles, and then experimented still further, tailoring to the strengths of the hardware in the laptop that I bought. So, why compare against consoles at all? Well, from my perspective, it's because we live in a world of multi-platform development. Xbox Series X, PlayStation 5, they are often the primary targets for games development and will be for the next 5 to 6 years minimum. If we can match or even exceed what they're doing on a portable device no less, I think that's actually really impressive. And all of the footage I've been playing out here, it's all from this Razer laptop with a 95-watt rendition of the RTX 3070 mobile. So yeah, Microsoft Flight Simulator, I've got it running at settings closely equivalent to Xbox Series X and it's running very nicely. Doom Eternal, whether it's with ray tracing enabled or disabled, the feature set of the RTX Silicon essentially allows you to exceed the fidelity of the console experience. Next-gen experiences, well, it's really early days for Unreal Engine 5, but yeah, the super demanding Valley of the Ancient demo runs to console specs on this laptop. And let's not forget that PC is at the forefront of innovation in the gaming space, always has been, always will be. The consoles are early on in their generational cycle, but next-generation technologies like ray tracing are now into their second iteration on PC. Minecraft RTX, a fully path-traced experience running on a laptop with a truly impressive 4K presentation and pretty good performance. We've seen a demo of this running on Xbox Series X, but so far no end product. Right, so I spoke about adapting the game experience to match the laptop. Well, as I said, this Razer comes with a 165Hz 1440p screen, so there are interesting opportunities here. Fundamentally, the next-gen consoles want to deliver a good experience for a living room 4K display. But if we can trade some of those 8.3 million pixels for higher performance, more visual features, or indeed both on this Razer's 1440p display, well, that's going to be pretty good, right? So let's dig into some specific examples here, and I think Remedy's Control is actually a great place to start. Here's the game running on Xbox Series X. Performance here is improved from launch, though according to the patch updates it's been some time since Remedy updated the code, so maybe there have been system level improvements from Microsoft in the meantime. But regardless, this is the performance mode and right now it's running pretty much locked to 60 frames per second. Series X essentially runs at the equivalent of PC's low settings with medium reflection quality at native 1440p, with a temporal upscaling pass to 2160p 4K. With hardware accelerated ray tracing, Series X invokes the ray-traced reflections and ray-traced transparency reflections we saw in the PC game, but they are essentially running on a lower setting than PC at its lowest. This quality setting is not actually accessible on the PC build. It was designed specifically for the RT capabilities of the consoles. Point is though, we don't actually need this lower quality setting for PC. On the 30 FPS side, I found that the RTX 3070 and the Razer could run RT reflections at the medium setting with additional fidelity over consoles, and in addition to that, we could increase the rasterization settings across the board. Introducing a 30 FPS cap, the performance level is just like the console builds, but we gain additional fidelity across the board. Higher precision ray tracing, improved shadows, reflections, level of detail, everything. Remedy built in a lot of overhead into their 30 FPS mode on the consoles, which we should take into account, but the fact is we're able to do the same on PC, and we have the flexibility to increase settings for better graphical quality. No reduction on resolution in the RT reflections is required on PC because, to put it bluntly, RTX cards have additional hardware to accelerate ray tracing calculations that the consoles do not have. So what about 60 frames per second? The console's performance mode delivers something very close to a locked experience, as I said, but ray tracing is removed completely, so basically whether you're on Series X or PlayStation 5, you choose either performance without ray tracing or 30 FPS with it. And yeah, I found that the RTX 3070 mobile processor is able to match the console quality experience with some extra love given in terms of higher quality textures and filtering compared to Series X. But the thing is that with the technologies on PC we have available, we do not need to make the trades that you need to on console. DLSS, machine learning based super sampling, well, we've talked a lot about that in the past. Actual internal resolution per frame is a lot lower, but a combination of temporal super sampling and machine learning inferencing is used to reconstruct an image that looks very close to full resolution and actually better in some scenarios. Point is, the RTX 3070 laptop can give you a 60 frames per second performance mode with ray tracing. You do not need to choose between performance and ray tracing, you can have both. And in actual fact, if you're okay with very mild drops beneath 60 FPS, you can even run with the full gamut of ray tracing features, some of which aren't available at all on any console version of Control. And of course, there is no need to use ray tracing if you don't want to, which takes us back to the fact that the Razer here ships with a 165Hz 1440p display. So what happens if you go back to the Console Plus spec I talked about earlier, which is essentially console quality settings with enhanced texture quality and filtering, and what if we rendered that at 1440p with DLSS balanced mode? Put simply, frame rate goes through the roof. We don't need to talk about 60 frames per second as a target when you can be looking at well over 100 frames per second instead. So this is basically an object lesson in the strengths of PC gaming. The console versions of Control are actually pretty great. But we have the flexibility on PC to add to the visual fidelity, not just with ray tracing, but with better standard settings too. And we can deploy DLSS to get that blistering performance, or we can use it to help offset the computational impact of hardware accelerated ray tracing with enough overhead to spare to add additional features. So this is why I'm talking about the performance of the RTX 3070 laptop here, not in benchmarking terms, X% slower or faster than another GPU, but rather in terms of application compared to a standard set by the machines that will play a hugely important role in mainstream gaming in the here and now, and obviously for years to come. Now, I'm going to be talking about Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition next, which is a title designed by developer 4A Games using a new iteration of its engine that only works with hardware accelerated ray tracing. You can view Control as a last-gen port perhaps, albeit one with some massive PC improvements, but the 4A engine here is built for the future, to get it running at 60 frames per second on consoles. 4A employed the heavy use of dynamic resolution scaling, going from anywhere between 1080p to about 1728p on Xbox Series X. On PS5, lowest bounds on resolution could actually go lower, under 1080p. Temporal supersampling is used to offset the variation in resolution, but DRS isn't available at all on PC. The point is though that certainly on our Razer RTX 3070 laptop, we don't need to use DRS. We can use DLSS performance mode to scale from 1080p to 4K at all times with excellent image quality results and perhaps crucially, consistent image quality that you don't get with dynamic resolution scaling. A console to PC direct comparison can't quite be done as 4A customized console settings quite a lot, but with high settings on PC, DLSS performance mode, you get a similar look and yeah, a perfectly presentable 4K presentation. But of course, we aren't really targeting 4K on the Razer, which has a 1440p screen, so again, we can do more with our rendering budgets. Drop down to 1440p, move to DLSS balanced mode, and well, suddenly we can make a lot more use of our 165Hz display. And on the most taxing stage of the game here, we're at 80 to 120 frames per second typically. And of course we have flexibility in where we trade. Sticking to DLSS balanced, we can ramp up RT settings and reintroduce very nice visual effects like tessellation that have always been present on the PC version of Metro, but are absent on consoles old and new. And if we stick to 60 frames per second as the target, I found that even on the most taxing stage in the game, the Taiga, the game could run on DLSS balance mode and could see us move both rasterization and RT settings up considerably beyond the console standard. The readout isn't a perfect 60 FPS, but it's not far off. Doom Eternal next, and well, wow. id Software targets maximum performance in all areas of the pipeline, their own code, their chosen API, in this case Vulkan, and it's delivered with phenomenal optimization across the board in terms of both CPU and GPU. Put simply, the game's a monster on PC, and the choices you have in how to tailor the experience are legion. But as to how it's deployed on Series X, well, 3 quality modes to choose from, basically starting with a ray tracing mode that tops out at 1800p resolution, but is dynamic. Does look pretty great actually. Then there's a non-RT mode that targets ultra settings at a target 4K, and then after that, a 120Hz mode with pared back settings and no RT, and again, dynamic 1800p, which drops to dynamic 1584p max on PS5. So again, consoles are offering a range of choices that balance available GPU power with resolution and effects. And as we saw in Alex's Doom Eternal video, DLSS performance mode at 4K offers significant image quality improvements over Series X in both its RT and 120Hz modes. We can have ultra settings across the board here, though we've tuned the texture pool to medium, which has little to no visual impact on the game, simply changes the size of the texture streaming buffer. Still, what we're getting here is very much a fully viable 4K 60 experience, comparable and indeed superior to PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. While the consoles are targeting ultra settings too, the ray-traced reflections are more akin to the medium setting, and we can power past that on PC and have RT at ultra settings too. So with all of that in mind, one might assume that the 1440p unlocked frame rate experience, more befitting of the screen in the Razer laptop, should be pretty tremendous, and yes it is. To be clear here, what you're seeing is the same settings we saw previously, just at 1440p resolution. Oh, and I've bumped up the DLSS setting from performance to balanced. Typically I prefer performance mode at 4K, balanced at 1440p and quality mode at 1080p. So yeah, balanced it is here. Typically, we are in a 100 to 140 FPS window with Doom Eternal, and remember that we do still have ultra quality ray tracing enabled here, where RT is disabled on consoles in 120Hz mode there. This game does actually support dynamic resolution scaling, so you could target a specific level of performance here and adjust resolution on the fly, just like you can on consoles. And yeah, dynamic resolution is also supported in this game with DLSS 2, meaning you have more options here. And speaking of options, if we retain the same settings but disable ray tracing, well obviously there's a further performance boost, and our frame rate window expands from around 140 FPS to around 200 FPS. Doom Eternal is not just beautifully optimized on all platforms, but all of the tools are delivered here to get a great experience tailored to the user's specific needs on PC. And yes, I can assure you that this is all being delivered by the 95W RTX 3070 within the Razer Blade 15 I bought from Amazon. So thus far we've seen a mobile computer match the outputs of the new wave of consoles on selected games, and yeah, one might argue that the selection I chose favours ray tracing and machine learning, strengths of the RTX silicon where the consoles have a technological disadvantage. On the one hand, I'd say that those features are not going away, they're going to be more fully utilised over time. But on the other hand, there are games that do not use these features, and therefore the dedicated RT cores and tensor cores in the RTX silicon will go underutilised, they won't be used at all. And there's no doubt that in some titles, consoles will brute force ahead in rasterisation performance depending on the quality of the PC port. So Assassin's Creed Valhalla, a game that springs to mind there. However, elsewhere, I still found that the RTX 3070 mobile chip could keep up without DLSS or ray tracing, and one of the most challenging tests is Microsoft Flight Simulator. Again, if you've seen our content, you'll know that Asobo Studio shared with us the configuration used in Xbox Series X, S, and how they correlate to PC's various quality settings. They asked us not to share the entirety of that document in full, but we are able to plug in all of those settings into our RTX 3070 powered Razer laptop for an almost exactly like-for-like setup. And here's what that looks like. Native rendering is at 1440p resolution, using temporal upscaling for a 4K output. That's on Series X. Again, I've replicated that setting as close as I could on my Razer PC. In actual fact, I'm at an internal 1512p resolution here, so a touch higher. Cockpit reflections apart, we're pretty much at ultra across the board in matching Series X settings, but the more interesting difference comes with draw distance. Series X uses a value here that is dynamic between 100 and 200 according to load. In PC terms, 100 is equivalent to the high setting, 200 to max. I settled on 150 for the Razer, literally right down the middle, which I found to produce pop-in that's generally further away on the laptop than it is on the console. Here's a look at how London performs on Series X. It's one of the densest areas of the game, and when flying at low altitude, it's stress testing the graphics rendering power of the machine, the CPU and storage. Generally holds its performance level, but you'll note here that there can be some stutter owing to the sheer density here. PC can stutter too, but less often. I'm pretty sure that even though the Razer has a 6-core 12-thread 10th gen core processor, it's still more performant than Series X here. Stutter in this game tends to be CPU related, not GPU. To be clear here, whatever system you play Flight Sim on, you can find various bottlenecks because fundamentally Asobo and Microsoft cannot optimize performance in this game for the whole world. On the laptop, I found this scene in Brazil that could cause performance dips. But I think the overall takeaway here is that a baseline for a high-end console experience was defined by the developer, and the RTX 3070 in the laptop can deliver these next-gen quality visuals with a good, consistent level of performance. Okay, so thus far we've stuck to console settings, but PC offers flexibility, right? For a start, we don't need to target a 4K output, whether it's upscaled or not, because our laptop screen is 1440p, which is a perfectly great resolution for a 15-inch display. Secondly, while the developers made their own choices for quality presets when they did their ports to Series X, well, back in the day we made our own series of optimized settings, or rather Alex did. Here we're going for 1440p on high settings, but with some tweaks a touch higher, particularly in texture quality. Generally we move into the mid-40s frame rate wise in London, going higher into the 50s occasionally. Frame rate isn't really key to the Flight Simulator experience, but this is very much a game that could benefit from a DLSS implementation. Or alternatively, you can lean in a touch to the game's internal temporal scaler. It's very good quality actually, but 1440p 90% resolution does look good and gains you a few frames, and that's what I'm using here for this test. So in recapping the testing here, I was looking for my new laptop to match the output of the consoles, and I think we've done that. And in fact, I was surprised in some cases that I could get so close. And looking at the benchmarks from the RTX 3070 mobile here, I expect you would be able to get similar results from a desktop rendition of the RTX 3060 or indeed the older RTX 2070. We've seen scenarios in other titles where the consoles punch above this weight, and I'd expect that in some scenarios resolution would need to be lowered with this laptop on those games. But equally, some game engines in the PC space just perform better on Nvidia hardware, Control being a good case in point. While ray tracing in games that supports it will likely produce better results on RTX simply because more aspects of the RT pipeline are accelerated with the Nvidia hardware. Mileage will vary, but the key point is that we have more flexibility in configuring the game, and the fact we don't need to target a 4K display, certainly not on this Razer. This allows us to redirect GPU resources to where we want them to go. So these are the games I've chosen from the here and now, but let's talk about next generation features and experiences. Looking to the future, I would expect to see Unreal Engine 5 to get a lot of pickup in shipping games. There are two core technologies here that are absolutely remarkable. Nanite is all about detail up to and including the very best of motion picture quality assets and the end of level of detail popping as we know it. Lumen is another technology. It's a form of software-based ray-traced global illumination. Now, Unreal Engine 5, it's important to stress that it's still in the early days of development at the moment. It's still subject to intense optimization, and per a recent presentation from Gears of War developer The Coalition, the current tech seems to have bottlenecking issues when the camera moves at speed. For this particular demo, a 1080p resolution with software-based temporal upscaling to 4K is the target for consoles running at 30 frames per second, and that's how I've compiled the demo here. Performance issues here in terms of inconsistent frame times are in line with the Coalition's comments on the tech, but as you can see, by and large, we are hitting the required frame rate target and exceeding it. Is a promising sign then for an emerging engine, and hardware accelerated ray tracing to streamline Lumen performance, that's going to be a big deal, and indeed DLSS still has to be integrated. So with all of that in mind, let's talk about my recommendations in purchasing a gaming laptop. I'd say that the deal I got with the Razer was really sweet, and it's not so much the GPU that is a limit here. Settings are scalable, resolutions can change, DLSS obviously helps a ton. Scalability on the CPU side is more difficult, and I would recommend an 8-core 16-thread processor. Game engines are increasingly becoming more multi-core aware, and looking to the future, all of those cores and threads will be more effectively utilized, and we're already seeing it in games like Cyberpunk 2077 and, well, many others. But I want to talk more about GPU performance though. Smaller form factors mean lower power budgets and reduced core clocks compared to desktop equivalents. The Razer here has a 95 watt power limit, but other laptops may be higher or lower, and you can expect performance to change according to power and cooling performance. Typically, the more power you put in, the more performance you get out, but it's not a linear relationship here. I previously looked at power scaling using an RTX 3080 laptop, and here's how that looked. Comparing 115 watts of GPU power to 150 watts, essentially 77% of max power is getting you 88% of the performance. The more power you pump into the chip, the more heat is generated, the less efficient it becomes, meaning you need higher speed, noisier fans, a bigger chassis, or in the case of the XMG Neo 17 unit I tested, both of them. I found acoustics to be fairly agreeable on the Razer, but this can change significantly from laptop to laptop. All of them have different cooling designs. As for the difference between my RTX 3070 in the Razer and the higher end 3080, well, the MSI GS66 Stealth I have here has a 95 watt RTX 3080, as close to an apples to apples comparison as we're going to get, and it's about 15% faster than the Razer in GPU bound scenarios, and also comes with 16 gigs of VRAM up against the 8 in the 3070, so a nice future-proofing feature there. But my personal opinion is that in pricing terms, the RTX 3070 seems to be at the sweet spot for 1440p laptop gaming. In fact, if we leave out acoustic, thermal and form factor considerations for a moment, if we go hell for leather with a 150 watt RTX 3080 as measured in the XMG Neo 17, get about 35% more performance compared to the Razer's 95 watt 3070. That gives you an idea of how my £1,400 purchase compares to a much more expensive, much larger, heavier, noisier laptop running with the 3080 almost fully tapped out. Food for thought, but of course there will be other iterations of the 3070 out there with higher power budgets than my Razer, which will help to close the gap. The point is that there are choices in the laptop market. Performance is all down to budget, cooling, power and form factor, so be sure to research thoroughly. Ultimately, it's about balancing all of those things, and you need to prioritize what's most important to you. But that's all from me for now, and I hope you enjoyed the content. It's been a chance to put into action some of the thinking I've been doing for some time now on improving GPU reviews generally. I mean, usually everything is ramped up to ultra settings and a product is defined by pricing and performance differentials. I think that information, obviously, is still hugely valuable, but ultimately it doesn't really tell you what you can actually do with your GPU in this new era of gaming. So yeah, in scenarios where settings can be matched, I do think there is some value here in terms of putting a prospective GPU into context with the kinds of workloads being asked of it. But that's it. That's the end of the video, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed putting it together. Lots of comparisons, data points, and some food for thought, I think, for future GPU reviews. And if you enjoyed the content, please do like, subscribe, share, and of course, if you are subscribed, ring the bell for those notionally instant notifications whenever a new video is published on the channel. Backers of the Digital Foundry Supporter Program can get hold of this video in pristine high quality for download. And with that, this is indeed the end of the video. So yeah, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.